Hello, this is Thomas Donald Jacobs for Paperboys on Thursdays. Hopefully it will still be Thursday, someplace by the time I get it uploaded. Um, Probably some of you weren't expecting to see me back so soon, but now that the worst of the side effects from the medication that I'm on have started to taper off and I can actually, type and do shit, um, I had planned on posting today, and I thought about it in light of what happened in Colorado Springs over the weekend. Um, and I've decided that I'm going to go ahead with the vlog for today that I had planned, even though the subject of transgender genocide might seem especially appropriate in some ways for Thanksgiving. But I will wait until next week or the week thereafter when I've had time to really collect my thoughts. Um, in the meantime, I know that a lot of people in the community are struggling right now, um, both because of the Colorado Springs massacre, as well as, at least for people in the US, this being that happy fun time of year with family gatherings. Um, and you might have to deal with conservative relatives who are not accepting, or even these days, liberal, turfy relatives who are not accepting, and people saying especially mean and hurtful, stupid shit right at this minute. Um, I hope that this vlog will help because it is on something super boring and totally not exciting. Uh, Pronouns, which I like as a topic because for several years I taught a class on historical English and how English changes and isn't really a prescriptive language. It's a lot more complicated than that. Um, if nothing else, maybe, the sound of my droning on about it for about half an hour will give you a little rest and help you fall asleep. See you back in a few. Bye. In this vlog, I'm going to talk about pronouns. So, what are pronouns? Why do we have them? How do they work? Why are pronouns an issue for some people? What we can observe, what they claim, and what's a cover. Then, does any of the historical stuff and the grammatical things really matter, at least from my point of view? And then lastly, how pronouns are contentious to a certain degree within the trans and queer community, and why I think they really shouldn't be. So, what are pronouns? How do we use them? Why do we have them? Now, I will preface this by saying that I am a historian. I'm not a linguist. I'm not, if you've heard me speak, you know this, a grammarian, okay? um, this is my understanding of pronouns as a historian and what is useful to me in terms of deciphering documents from the modern, early modern, and medieval eras. So I have provided you with a general definition of noun at the bottom for those of you who need a little bit of refresher. And then the two top definitions given by Merriam-Webster's, which I've selected over Oxford English Dictionary because I think that most of my audience is probably American English speaking. And for those of you who are not, who are from the UK or, the Commonwealth, don't worry, the Oxford English Dictionary will be mentioned later on. I have put in bold the words such as in both definitions as a reminder that these are not exhaustive, definitive lists of all the pronouns. The definitions just give some examples. So the first definition describes pronouns in general. And it says any of a small set of words such as I, she, he, you, it, we, or they in a language that are used as substitutes for nouns, so replacements for words, or noun phrases, and whose reference, the word that they are substituting for, are named or understood in the context. The second definition is a more recent addition. It's not a new definition, it's just new that it is now the second definition, okay? And it's been added because when everyday people discuss pronouns, as they do now, they don't mean pronouns in general. They mean these pronouns specifically. And so Merriam-Webster's has decided to make this the second definition now. The third person personal, note the word personal, pronouns, such as he, him, she, her, and, yes, that's right, they, them, also listed as a third person personal pronoun in the Oxford English Dictionary, by the way, that a person goes by. Okay, you're probably familiar with all of these pronouns. But what sets the second apart from the first definition is how the pronouns are chosen. All right? We understand how they're used, how pronouns are used. You pop them in for another word where people already know what that other word is because you either said it or you're in a space or a conversation where it's already understood. All right? Words that replace other words. All right? But how are they chosen? Now, in general, so in reference to the first definition, pronouns are chosen entirely by the speaker or writer. And they may not always be chosen on the basis of grammar, as many people think. There are different reasons for the selection of particular pronouns. For example, tradition. There is no real reason, apart from a cultural tradition, to refer to boats and ships as she and her. They can also be selected on the basis of grammar, okay? Plural versus singular. They can also be selected on the basis of style or rhetoric. For example, in historical debates, there's an ongoing discussion concerning institutions and what are appropriate pronouns to refer to them by. If you use it to refer to an institution made up of many individuals, you are giving the impression that the institution is a monolith rather than a group of people with different points of view. So, what you choose indicates a certain line of thought or an impression that you want to give. But it has nothing really to do with grammar. Third person personal pronouns are special in that there's some direction as to how to select them. And the direction is that you select the pronoun used on the basis of what the person you are talking about prefers. Yeah, that's why they're called personal pronouns, not your personal pronouns. The third person's, the person you are talking about's pronouns, okay? That is how they are used. Now, this isn't always clear if you are a historian, because, and I know some people may find this shocking or news, but gender fluid, transgender, non binary, gender non-conforming people existed in the past, all right? And as a historian, it can be really hard to determine what that person preferred and when, and how to incorporate that into your research. Sometimes you have to read pages and pages and pages and pages of documents and books, and you may need to include footnotes in your research explaining your decision, okay? Happily, when you are talking about people who are alive, you have the option of asking them, all right? Or just respecting them when they say, these are my pronouns. And I'm not talking about respecting people who say, my pronouns are patriot/American, or my pronouns are attack helicopter, because those people clearly don't know what pronouns are and can go fuck themselves. All right? Now, why do we have pronouns? Let's all be thankful that we do, because pronouns are basically language lube. My specialty as a researcher is weirdly monarchies and ceremonies. I have to write a lot about kings and queens. It is much, 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 much quicker for me to, after first giving the noun, replace it with she or he, rather than each time writing out whatever king or queen's name is along with their absurd list of titles. If every time anyone referred to the former Queen of England and had to give her full name and all of her titles rather than just saying she, we'd basically not be able to talk at all. So, like I said, language lube. It just means that things go a lot quicker and are a lot less boring because you're not wasting time with the same specifics over and over and over again. I think there's also something psychological when it comes to people who refuse to use first person personal pronouns, so I, and instead use their own full name when talking about themselves and what they do. It sounds psychotic to listeners for some reason. Megalomaniacs seem to have that tendency. Donald Trump does it a lot, for example. I don't know why that is. Perhaps someone can explain the psychology of that in the comments. I'd like to know why. I just know that it's a thing. Now, why is something so simple, the use of third person personal pronouns for people who are living and breathing, such an issue for some people? There's three things here. What I can observe about the people for whom this is such a problem, what they claim is the problem, and finally, the cover. All right. So, a claim that they make, or which is made on their behalf by some people, which is kind of a bullshit claim. So, first, the observable. What I can observe boils down to people who just don't know what pronouns are. These are the people who say things like, I don't use pronouns, when that is clearly not the case. And people who think that pronouns are a big secret. I don't want to share my pronouns. What I've noticed about those people is that if you use a neutral pronoun for them, such as they, them, they will swiftly correct you with their third person personal pronouns. All right. And then people not knowing how third person personal pronouns work. Okay. And not understanding that the third person personal pronouns are not your personal pronouns, but the pronouns of the third person, the person you are talking about. And they are the people that choose them. All right? So it's a lot of ignorance and meanness. Okay? The claim that is often made by transphobic people is that they refuse to use someone's personal pronouns because of a conspiracy theory, basically. That transgender people are trying to take over the world with our scary trans agenda and pass laws about what language can be used and can't be used. Okay. If you just stop and think for a brief minute and look at bills that are being proposed and actually are being passed, they're not being proposed by or passed by trans people or in our favor. Okay. There's not that many of us. We tend not to be that well organized, sadly. And we generally just don't have that much money. Okay. So unknot your knickers and calm yourself. All right. What is actually happening is that governments, public and private institutions, companies that run, media, social media platforms are putting in place and making it clear under workplace regulations and terms of service that transphobia and harassing someone by refusing to acknowledge their third person personal pronouns and how third person personal pronouns work is bigotry. And just like all other kinds of bigotry, you got to leave that shit at home. Okay? If you're going to bring it to work or do it out in public and the company you're working for says, yeah, that we don't do that here. Like, we don't want people using the N word or sexually harassing people. You got to go now. That is what is happening. It's not an attack on freedom of speech by the evil transes, okay? It's a consequence of speech that people who like their bigotry and can't keep it to themselves or at home or in their church or wherever they normally do it are gonna face, like other bigots do. That's what it is. And along with this is, of course, the wannabe victimhood, where these groups of generally moderately well off cis people, um, are feeling victimized by how third person personal pronouns work, as well as the imaginary, well funded, extremely well connected, very powerful trans cabal or whatever. Okay, they like having that little, I'm being attacked. It's the same thing with people who are screaming that they got canceled on Netflix. All right, if you're on Netflix screaming about how you've been canceled, you ain't been canceled. And then there's the cover. Okay, I often see this from people who will say, "Well, I don't have anything against trans people, but it's never good when someone says, I don't have anything against X group, but yeah. I don't have anything against trans people, but what about proper English?" Okay. The next slide is going to talk about why that's kind of bogus. Okay. So, pronouns in use. For the people who say, yeah, but what about grammar? What about proper English? First, I'm going to make the not especially unique observation that the people that say those things do not themselves speak perfect, proper English in most instances. Okay, so I guess they only care about quote unquote proper English, uh, you know, when it suits them. But also, what proper English? Pick a period. I mean, that's the thing. Grammar evolves. And I know this as a historian. This is something that I cover with my students. You don't start getting widespread talk of grammar and what is proper English grammar until the end of the 16th century and on into the 17th century. And it's purely because of the increase in printed materials. More people are writing, more people are reading. That's as a result of first the introduction of the printing press to England towards the end of the 15th century, the increase in literacy via the focus on being able to read the Bible in English via the English Reformation in its various forms, a rising middle class as a result of largely the start of England's merchant ventures and later conquests. And so at the end of the 16th and especially in the 17th century, you suddenly see an absolute plague of books about English grammar. And what I've noticed, having read these books, is that the authors generally do not agree with each other and nobody wins. I don't find it useful as a historian or as someone living in the world today to talk that much about proper English and English grammar. Because, again, pick one. And 50 years from now, whether you like it or not, it will have changed. But let's look at some of this proper grammar and proper English. It's not as simple as people think. So, one of the big ones that causes people so much consternation, the singular use of they. Well, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, singular they, at least in reference to an unknown person, has been in use since at least 1375. And we can say at least since, because generally words circulate in different usages before they are described in dictionaries. That comes after. Singular they, also quite common. Still in use today. People use it all the time. People say things like, oh, someone left their keys here. Would you let them know where they are? Now, that wasn't always the case. There was some pushback between the 16th and 19th centuries with the push to use he rather than they as a generic singular. It's kind of an interesting idea, but it was purely ideologically driven. It had nothing to do with grammar or proper English. There was just a belief that came about as a result of an increased focus on the observation of the natural world, that writing should reflect nature, and the idea of nature, as described by old white men, was that old white men were the template for all other people. That's something that unfortunately we still are dealing with today, for example, in medicine. So there was a push to use he rather than they as the generic singular. Nothing to do with grammar, nothing to do with proper English. Totes a result of a warped ideology that I think we can all say we are better off without. They, as a singular for known persons, was added to Merriam-Webster's in 2019. But it's been in circulation a lot longer than that. because, as I have pointed out, dictionaries are descriptive. They describe things after they've happened. And sometimes it can take a while for words to enter a dictionary. They have committees for these things. Then you. You has changed a lot. Today, you is used as a singular. You use it when you're talking to one person. You, one person. But it used to be the case prior to the 17th century, really prior to the end of the 16th century, that you was plural, or a formal, polite you, which is a distinction that we don't have in English anymore, although it is a distinction that remains in many other languages, such as Spanish, Dutch, French, I think German and Italian as well, and probably many other European languages. It was the word that you would use to address someone whose ass you wanted to kiss. And the singular you, we are still familiar with, but in very limited circumstances. So, people who go to Ren Fair, people who watch a lot of historical dramas, which are often quite inaccurate in terms of their usage for the period that they are representing. And people who are forced to listen to the King James Bible on a regular basis. So it used to be the case that singular you came in several different forms. Thou, thee, thy, thine, thyself. All right? But that changed. Even when the King James Bible was being compiled, you, as a singular, had already become the predominant form of you. And thou, thee, thy, thine, thyself was considered archaic and old-fashioned sounding. But the compilers of the King James Version decided to go with that old-fashioned, more archaic sounding version of you in its various forms as a way of lending legitimacy and a sense of age, a sort of patina of antiquity to what was a very new and extremely controversial version of the Bible. So, a selection of pronoun for stylistic rather than grammatical reasons. Some communities did retain that manner of speech, most notably the Quakers. In fact, alongside their opposition to slavery, using thou, thee, thy, thine, thyself was what they were most famous for in the American colonies. But generally speaking, not actually in use today. How about we? Normally, when we think of the word we think of the plural we. But there's 4 single forms that a lot of English speakers are going to be familiar with and may find irritating, as I do, for different reasons. So the royal we, most familiar to people from the thing supposedly, but probably not, said by Queen Victoria, "We are not amused." I would do away with that simply because I think that monarchies should be done away with. Then there's the editorial we, where someone gives an opinion and uses we as a sort of, I'm speaking for a particular community. Um, there are some circumstances where that is more legitimate than others, I feel, but has to be examined, not taken for granted. There's the authorial we, which you see a lot in research papers, where even though there's only one name at the top of the paper, the author will persist in using we rather than I when talking about their research. I find this annoying, and I think it should be done away with. It's a cheap rhetorical trick, I feel, to try and create objectivity where there is none, and to draw the reader in and make them feel as though they are part of the research by virtue of reading the paper, and thus predispose them to the author's conclusions. I'm not a fan. And then there's the second person kind of we, which is patronizing. Like when you go to the doctors and they say, "How are we feeling today?" We are not feeling anything, but, you know, my back hurts. Thanks for asking. So we tolerate all of these different usages of we rather than the generally understood grammatical. And then lastly, there are the neopronouns, which I feel should just be called pronouns. Neo, new. These are not new. Not even close to new in some instances. If a word is well over 150 years old, I kind of feel like it's time to just accept that it's a thing and stop calling it new. It's by now not some sort of linguistic hula hoop fad. So there's all of that about pronouns. And why people who are concerned about proper English aren't making a very good argument. Because again, which proper English? Are you just gonna pick the proper English of a certain period, apparently prior to now, and say, and that will be the English used forever and ever and ever, amen. Good luck with that. it's ridiculous, and it's not practical. Language does evolve, which I'm grateful for because it keeps me employed. I wouldn't have to teach historical English if English never changed. So, having gone over quite quickly, in fact, some elements of pronoun usage, past and present, leaves me with the question, does any of that matter? And I, as a historian, have to say, in the specifics, not that much. People who look at the past and pick out how things were done at a particular time and in a very small place in the context of the vast scope of human history, and then say, we must do it this way because whatever, I like it that way, I think are misusing the past. They're simplifying it to a point at which it becomes trivial and meaningless. I'm not interested in trivia in that sense. I mean, I like to play Trivial Pursuit and Jeopardy as much as the next person, but that is not what the study of history is for. Um, I think that the past is much more interesting in its complexity and nuances for what it can show us in terms of possibilities. Um, Expand our sense of what can be done, not as a straitjacket. Um, and the people who like to have these little nostalgic fantasies over a very simplified version of the past that only pertained to a very specific group of people in a very specific time in a very specific place, um, it seems to me often are using it as an excuse to oppress others. And I'm not really on board for that. The specifics, I think, matter a lot less in many conversations than looking at possibilities, how things change, um, trends, I think, are especially pertinent right now to the transgender and our allies community. Um, Maybe taking a look at a certain period in the past and saying, wow, that was awful. What led up to that? And might we be headed towards the same destination? Um, I think that's useful. But the specifics as a sort of limit or break on the personal choices that people make, I I don't think that that's good. Um, that's something that I was confronted with myself rather recently, as I have increasingly started to encounter people who have chosen it as a third person personal pronoun. Um, because as a historian with a particular interest in the English language, I am unaware of any past usage of it in reference to a human being that wasn't meant as a way of conveying disgust. Um, and as a transgender individual, I know I'm not alone in having had that word spat at me and been used as a way of dehumanizing me. But again, as a historian, I'm aware that in particular, since the civil rights era, um, minority groups have actively started to reclaim words, um, and use them in reference to themselves as a form of empowerment. So, what is more interesting there? The specific historical usage of the word it, or a historical trend that frees people? I'm going to go with the historical trend that frees people. So, lastly, I feel for the sake of transparency, I should point out that pronouns are a subject of some debate within the transgender and larger queer community. Um, it's not just cishet folk that talk about these things. And I think the first and largest concern that some people express has to do with the optics. Um, and mostly what is seen as problematic in this sense are non binary people. Uh, this is really respectability politics, especially coming from, you know, segments of the gay community who have already accrued some degree of acceptance and some civil rights protections. But as a historian, I am obliged, I feel, to point out that I am unaware of any minority group that has gained long term progress by throwing certain segments of its population under the bus at the behest of our oppressors. That's not a winning strategy as far as I am aware. If someone knows of a particular minority that, you know, gained their freedom, as it were, by sacrificing members that are especially singled out or disliked by the dominant group, you know, let me know, because I'm not sure on that. Also, um, I would point out that blue haired I and they them pronouns are not why someone picks up a gun and goes out and kills a bunch of queer people at random. That's not it. That is not it. That might be something that's brought up by the stochastic terrorists that egg this kind of shit on. But at the end of the day, that's not the reason. Also, some of this is intergenerational, and I understand, particularly in largely white Western society, where there's been a specific evolution of ideas about what a transgender identity is that is not found in other parts of the world, that older trans people were forced to do certain things. And a lot of that was focused on conforming to Western cishet normativity. And I respect that people had to go through all of those struggles, and it caused them a lot of pain and trauma that they're still dealing with now. But that being said, my question for older trans people who are worried about non binary trans people or trans people from other cultural backgrounds who don't fit into that binary very well, all of that pressure to conform to cishet normativity with rules about, well, you have to wear this and you can't wear that, and you have to dress like this person and not like that person, and these are the hobbies that's appropriate for you and these aren't. And here is how you have to talk, and you can't say this, and you have to pitch your voice like that. All of that stuff, if it wasn't your choice and it didn't really give you gender euphoria to do it all of the time, I don't know. Do we have to internalize those rules and then pass them on to the next generation of trans people? I just kind of feel like it's kind of an awful thing to do if we ain't gotta. There's also some worries within the binary transgender community that pronouns, and again, this is coming back to non binary people, are a distraction. Well, whose distraction is that exactly? That some cis people are upset by it doesn't mean that it has to become our problem. I think that binary trans people need to recognize that not everyone has their background, and not everyone experiences their trans identity just like them. And for those people, myself included, pronouns aren't a distraction. Um, they're important to us too. And if you can use binary pronouns and that gives you euphoria, all the better for you. But that's not something that applies to everyone. So it's a little bit of a thing about privilege, which I know is weird to discuss, within the trans community, but privilege is a very relative thing, and you might have it in one area and not in another. And, just maybe a little bit of acknowledgement that not everyone's coming from the exact same space as you. And then there's also a discussion within the non binary, gender fluid section of the trans community about whether it's appropriate for some people to use some pronouns and not others. For example, mixing pronouns, which, even though in a general conversation I will say that I'm trans masc or just a trans guy because I don't want to get into all of the details of my life with every fucking person that I meet. Um, but I will use mixed pronouns, he, they, because it's, I feel, the closest I can get to in English as an expression of my identity from my cultural point of view. I don't think that this is something that we really need to police or be super worried about. I don't. Who wants to interrogate every trans person that they meet about their pronouns and who has the right to use that pronoun? That seems kind of weird. And for my part, I'm just gonna take people's pronouns on, if they appear to be speaking in good faith, whatever. Um, go for it. And for me, I can't. I have other concerns. Um, and when I say good faith, I don't mean uh, a murdering piece of shit who decided that he was non binary overnight because his lawyers told him it would help him avoid a hate crime charge. that's not good faith, and I'm not going to worry about that person's non binary identity. I think we can mostly recognize that that's not good faith. Um, Although, that's going to be a call that people are going to have to make for themselves. So that was the end of the little presentation. I know you're all grateful. And I'll see you back in a few. Hey, so if you made it far in this exceedingly long vlog, you've probably noticed that what happened this past weekend is kind of weighing on my mind. Um, I think it's weighing on a lot of people's minds. Uh, what I'd like to say for the time being, until I can, collect my thoughts a little bit more, is my usual. Make good decisions, look out for each other, be careful. And, that veteran who helped bring down the shooter, he and his wife own a brewery. And one of their key things at their brewery is inclusivity, um, and diversity. And they also have a merch shop. So I'm going to put the link below and hope that people go and buy them out. Buy all their stuff. Get all of it. And also, maybe consider buying a really nice pair of high-heeled boots for any of your trans femme friends. I feel like that would be a good investment. And yeah, see you soon. Bye.